Bienvenido a un nuevo contenido de Uninorte Co. No olvides suscribirte a nuestro canal.
Good morning to everyone. It is a pleasure to be this morning with you, or with all of you. We are going to have a presentation by James Robinson, a well-known economist who doesn't need presentation. But I was just say that he has, with his colleagues, Daron Acemoglu, has had a very large influence in the study of long-run economic development and the determinants of long-run economic growth, which has generated a tremendous amount of discussion, of literature, and advances in our knowledge about the determinants of long-run growth. And he today will be presenting a paper he's preparing with some of his Colombian colleagues, which is titled "Legal Rebellion, Constitutional Design in Weakly Institutionalized Societies," which refers to the Colombian case between 1863 and 1991. So it is a pleasure to have Professor Robinson from the University of Chicago with us, and I welcome him, and we look forward to his talk. With which one of the talks that we have programmed to celebrate 20 years of our Department of Economics. So, Professor Robinson, welcome to the channel of the Universidad del Norte.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. And sorry not to. I'd much rather be in person in Barranquilla than sitting here in snowy, freezing cold Chicago. So let me share my screen, and we can get going. All right. Okay, good. Thank you. Yes. So thanks for inviting me. And I'm going to talk today. I wasn't quite sure what was appropriate, but I thought I would talk about a project that I've been working on for quite some time with my Colombian collaborators, as Adolfo said. That's Leopoldo Ferguson and Santiago Torres at the Universidad de los Andes in Bogota, and Javier Mejia, who was a former PhD student of mine, who's now teaching at New York University in Abu Dhabi. And it's about legal, it's what's it about? Legal rebellion. You'll see in a minute what's that about. But I think we've been trying to think about, is Colombia the way it is, and why it's been such a disorderly place for so long. Okay, I think everybody knows the statistics. For many years, Colombia was the homicide, kidnapping, and drug-producing capital of the world. It's been racked since civil wars, and one of the interesting thing about civil wars. So I have some data on homicide rates here. Here's Colombia. Central America have very high homicide rates. This goes back to about 1950. Interestingly enough, Colombia has a peak during La Violencia in the 1950s, and then it sort of takes off during the bad days of Pablo Escobar and the paramilitaries. And so this we know. This is just data from Correlates of War on the incidence of civil wars. So they define a civil war in terms of the number of people who die a year. So there has to be at least 1,000 combat deaths per year for that year to count as having a civil war. Many Latin American countries had lots of civil wars in the 19th century. Argentina had a lot of civil wars in the 19th century. If I go to the next slide, Venezuela had a lot of civil wars in the 19th century. Peru had quite a few. But what's interesting about Colombia is that, they had, like Venezuela, a lot of civil wars in the 19th century, but then they carried on having civil wars in the 20th century, whereas many other places that were very civil war torn in the 19th century, stabilized in the 20th century. You know, you see in Venezuela, the incidents of civil war disappeared. So this is actually something that the great historian Malcolm Dees pointed out once in a paper where he was comparing Ecuador, Venezuela, and Colombia, that in the 19th century, they look very similar in terms of political cleavages and conflicts and civil wars. But what's odd about Colombia is that Colombia sort of carries on looking the way it did in the 19th century, in the 20th century. And in some sense, that fact is part of the motivation for this research, as you'll see. The other motivation for this research that got us thinking about this was actually a remark by the politician Antonio Navarro and former guerrillero Antonio Navarro at a conference to Leopoldo when Leopoldo was discussing some of these issues with him. And he said, what you don't understand is that it's every Colombian's right to overthrow the government. So think about that, and we'll come back to it. Okay, so I'm going to put this problem of order, if you like, in the sort of very kind of traditional political theory, political science context, which is Hobbes's famous book, 17th century book, Leviathan. So, the most famous work in political theory about the problem of order and how one solves the problem of order is Hobbes's book, Leviathan. So Thomas Hobbes was writing this book during the English Civil War, and he started with a model, a very simple model. There's quite a bit of discussion of kind of human behavior, and he says men are prone to quarrel, they're prone to dispute, and this leads to a state of affairs that he characterized as war, W-A-R-R-E, with a sort of archaic spelling, which he noted resulted in continual fear, the danger of violent death, and a life which was poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So this was an anarchic situation. And Hobbes's solution, of course, to this anarchic situation was what he called a Leviathan, which was a powerful state. Okay, so the front of Hobbes's book has this famous etching of the Leviathan. The Leviathan was a monster from the book of Job in the Bible, and you have to create this very powerful state. How did this powerful state come about? He discusses different ways, but one is through a sort of covenant. People get together and they unanimously agree that this is a solution to their problem. Now, immediately Hobbes had written that book. There was a lot of criticism of it, and I just want to focus on one criticism and one proposed solution, because I think that's relevant for the Colombian case, which is John Locke's second treatise of government. So Locke sort of says, okay, I agree. He changes the terminology from war to the state of nature, and he says, I easily grant that civil government is the proper remedy for the inconveniences of the state of nature, which must certainly be great. But absolute monarchs are but men. So Hobbes's idea was to be an absolute monarch, at the top of this Leviathan. And Locke just sort of questioned whether the absolute monarch had the incentives to really act in the collective interest. I desire to know what kind of government that is and how much better it is than the state of nature. So Locke argued, what security, what defense is there in such a state against the violence and oppression of the absolutist ruler? So if you create a Leviathan, what's to stop the Leviathan, abusing you? That's what he wanted to know. And and his solution to that was, we need to worry about the institutional design. So if we're going to have a state which acts in the interests of society, we need to have an institutional design that guarantees that. So this is where, popular control of government appears. This is the people could never be safe nor at rest, nor think themselves in civil society till the legislature was placed in collective bodies of men. So you need to have popular control of government. Also, the separation of powers. He has a very clear statement of the fact that you have to separate powers between the executive and the legislature. So institutional design, that kind of solves this problem that he identified with having a strong state. So, this is an intellectual tradition which had enormous consequences, for the way the British state was organized after the Glorious Revolution, and of course, for the Federalists who wrote the US Constitution. When James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, and others met in Philadelphia, they actually weren't supposed to rewrite the Constitution. They were just meant to amend the Articles of Confederation, which was the existing Constitution in the United States. But they were very afraid of disorder. In fact, just as this process was underway, a big rebellion broke out in Western Massachusetts called Shays' Rebellion. And it turned out that the central government basically didn't have the resources or ability to build an army to intervene to eliminate the rebellion. The Massachusetts government, the state government, had to raise a militia to do it. So this was very high on their thought. How do we contain order? We need to make the central state stronger to contain order. They couldn't pay for George Washington's army. Okay, so that was this. It's a very Hobbesian agenda, but of course they were also very concerned about the same issues that Locke was concerned about. How could you avoid the central state abusing society? But with respect to disorder, how did they tackle it? Well, there's a famous treason clause in the Constitution which defines what treason is, or what sedition is, or what rebellion against the state is. And it left the punishment to the first Congress. So the Constitution it defines treason, but it doesn't specify the punishment. But Hamilton talked quite a lot about this in the Federalist Papers. And here he is in Federalist 27. The hope of impunity is a strong incitement to sedition. The dread of punishment, a proportionately strong discouragement. So Hamilton's view was clear. How do you avoid treason and sedition? Punish it hard. Okay. Of course, Hamilton notes sedition and insurrection are bound to happen, and there's no remedy but force. Okay. So part of this institutional architecture that they created in Philadelphia involved strong punishment of sedition and rebellion. Okay, and indeed, the first Congress stipulated that the death penalty would apply to sedition. Okay, so if you rebelled against the state in the United States, it was the death penalty. Okay, so let me contrast the death penalty and this view of sedition in the United States to the 1980 Colombian Penal Code. This is what Antonio Navarro pointed out to us. So, here's the Colombian, let me read this out, the 1980 Colombian Penal Code. Crimes against the constitutional regime. Chapter 1, of rebellion, sedition, that's what Hamilton was talking about, and riot. Article 125, rebellion. Those who by use of arms attempt to overthrow the national government, or who delete or modify the legal or constitutional regime by force, incur imprisonment of 3 to 6 years. Not exactly the death penalty. 3 to 6 years. In fact, the original proposal of the commission was 1 to 6 years, not 3 to 6 years. We've been collecting data. It's hard to get more historic data about the amount of time in Colombia people have served in prison for sedition. And in fact, what we find is the average amount of time people spend in prison has been 3 years. So this is going back 20 years. Okay, so 3 years in prison actually. So that's the kind of minimum of this 1980 penal code. Okay, so if you take the logic of Hamilton, this is rather odd. Colombia has been a very disorderly place. And Hamilton would say, how do you solve this problem of sedition? You have to punish it hard. But the Colombians have done the opposite. They punished it weakly. So in equilibrium, there's been a lot of sedition, and it's been punished weakly. So I guess this project is about, what's the logic of that? Okay, how do you understand that? So to start by examining that logic, let's look at the logic of the commission that wrote the 1980 Penal Code. So So, it's interestingly enough, it's the debate amongst these legal scholars who wrote the penal code is documented, and it's very, very revealing, the discussion. Okay, so here's Senor Romero. This is the proceeding of the penal code. So this is the debate that led to that penal code that I showed you. Here's what Senor Romero says. Rebellion implies absolute disagreement with the system and the understanding that change can be achieved in no other way than with armed uprising. Rebellion is the tool of the oppressed. Well, if rebellion triumphs, nothing happens. But if they're defeated, it would be excessive to punish them for the actions of the essence of combat. So his view is, well, rebellion is bound to happen. People disagree with the system, and and sometimes you win and sometimes you lose. But if you lose, it would be excessive to punish such a normal thing in society. Okay, here's Senor Gutierrez. Political crimes like rebellion must have some privileges concerning punishment. Not exactly Hamilton's view. Rebels logically conspire, use military clothes, fake documents, violate private property. It's all part of an uprising. But I would consider it convenient to structure a norm specifying not to punish rebels committing punishable acts in connection with combat. So again, these are legal scholars. These are not Marxist intellectuals. They're legal scholars. I would consider it, convenient to structure a norm not to punish rebels. So here in the 1970s, rebellion is sort of treated as a kind of normal activity that this is exactly what Antonio Navarro was talking about. Rebellion was treated as a kind of normal activity. Okay, now not everybody agreed with this. Senor Gaitan sort of says, no, come on, seriously. Considering this norm that there is no sanction for rebels, norm is, I'll come back to the word norm. It's true that its origin can be traced to derecho de gentes. But I think it should not be approved. Some romantic arguments have been put forth here, but they lack the force to justify a text of this nature. So he was defeated, but he was saying, oh, come on, seriously. So derecho de gentes. So this is the origin of this. So what is the derecho de gentes? Okay, the law of nations. Okay, so the law of nations, it's actually it's part of Roman law, which stipulates the relations between belligerent countries fighting a war and the kind of rights and obligations that govern interstate relations. But what Gaitan was referring to was Article 91 of the 1863 Rio Negro Colombian Constitution. That was proposed by a very famous liberal intellectual politician economist, actually. He made some very famous income per capita estimates in the 1860s, Salvador Camacho Roldan. So here's the clause. This is, there were different versions of this, but here's the clause that got into the Constitution. Derecho de gentes is part of the internal legislation of the United States of Colombia, and its norms will rule, especially in the cases of civil war or rebellion. Therefore, these may be finalized through treaties between belligerent sides who must respect the humanitarian practices of civilized nations. So what the liberals did was they took this principle, which sort of applied between nations, and applied it within a country. So there were some people anticipated this. Andres Bello, for example, the famous legal scholar, kind of anticipated this idea. But the idea was, a civil war breaks out. There's rebellion. Okay, you don't punish people. You kind of finalize it with treaties, and you stop fighting and. Okay, the previous version of this memorable phrase, which is sort of interesting given this debate in the 1970s, this didn't get into the final version of the Constitution, but it said, the United States of Colombia does not recognize political crimes. It's politics. It's not a crime. Stuff happens. So in this project, we're trying to understand the logic, or we're trying to identify different logics that could have led to this very different type of solution. And what's interesting, if you read the debate around the time of the US Constitution, or the debate around the time of the Rio Negro Constitution, many features are the same. These people in Rio Negro, these people like Camacho Roldan, he was a very sophisticated guy. He'd read the Federalist Papers. You know, he knew about the types of issues and problems that society faced. And they thought about the same sorts of solutions that the United States had chosen, but they just thought that wouldn't work in Colombia. And I think that's, you know, that's what we're trying to sort of elucidate. So how do we do that as economists? Well, we write a model down. So I don't know how well this is going to work, but let me give you a flavor of how we're going to think about this, and I'll jump to try to give you the intuition for the main results. Perhaps I'll show you the game tree. So what we want to, you know, and this is the title of this paper is, you know, constitutional design. So we're thinking about you know, the liberals and conservatives debating or bargaining over a constitution. So it's true that there weren't that many conservatives in Rio Negro. I don't know if Mosquera was a liberal or a conservative. Sometimes he was one, sometimes he was another. But certainly there'd just been a civil war, which the liberals had won. You know, the conservatives were around, and very shortly afterwards, the conservatives were running Antioquia. So that's, you know, that's, we want to think of this as a kind of a bargain between the liberals and the conservatives. And what are they negotiating over? Well, they're negotiating over how much to penalize rebellion. You know, should we penalize rebellion a lot, or should we, you know, penalize it a little? So you write this constitution in Rio Negro, then what happens? Well, then the constitution plays out. And it plays out, first of all, with an election. Somebody wins and somebody loses. So think of I as the liberals, the incumbents, you know, and think of C as the conservatives or the competitors. And there's an election. Somebody wins, somebody loses. And whoever wins has to implement the constitution. So they have to choose a policy. We call that Tao. Like they have to choose some policy. You can think of that as something which influences resource distribution, decisions about taxation or public good provision. And then there's a random variable is realized that actually determines the resource distribution. So resource distribution is determined by this policy, but also theta, okay? And the way we're going to think about this is theta is very uncertain, okay? So, and we're going to try to think about that in terms of the institutions of the Colombian state have very uncertain consequences. You know, it's very difficult to implement policy in Colombia. Look at the peace process with the FARC. You know, lots of things don't get implemented. My favorite example of this is when my friend Sergio Jaramillo was Vice Minister of Defense under President Uribe. He was trying to implement the sort of civilian side of the Seguridad Democrática. And, you know, they wanted to build a road from Bogota to Macarena so that they could take the Norwegian ambassador and the French ambassador, you know, on the nice road to Macarena, which was one of these prioritized areas they were trying to stabilize. And he just couldn't get the road built. You know, he didn't, you know, where the money disappeared, you know, nobody had the right incentives, the road just couldn't, he just couldn't build the road. The road just didn't get built. So there's this problem of, you know, you can pass a law, but what's actually going to happen? There's an enormous amount of uncertainty about that. So we're going to capture that in a, you know, in a simple way in a model by this. There's some realization of this random variable, and that's very uncertain. And we want to say, you know, that's kind of capturing the fact that this is a weakly institutionalized context. That's, you know, in the title of the paper. That it's very difficult. And, you know, the importance of that is going to be, it's very difficult to sort of structure outcomes in the way that Madison and Hamilton thought you could by kind of fine-tuning the institutions. Remember the way I talked about Locke, when Locke identified, okay, yeah, it's good to have a state, but the problem is the state might not have the incentives to work in the interests of society. What was Locke's solution to that? Locke's solution was institutional design. And I think one of the fundamental arguments we're making here is that that's very difficult for that to work in Colombia, because there's just enormous uncertainty about the consequences of particular institutional designs. Okay, so after this policy and this realization of theta, then the opposition, you know, has to decide, do they rebel or not? Do they rebel? You know, so they could settle and they could sort of decide, okay, fine, we'll just accept the distribution of resources implied by the realization of theta and this policy tau, whatever it is, or they could rebel. So if there's a rebellion, with some exogenous probability, it succeeds, and if it succeeds, the opposition kind of take everything. Okay, you could say they take, their payoff is Y. And if it fails, they have to pay this penalty. Okay, so obviously here, the incentive to rebel depends on the penalty. So the lower is the penalty, the less bad it is to lose. The less bad it is to lose. Other things equal, the more likely you are to rebel. Okay, but of course, it's a game, so it's a strategic interaction, and so the policy that the government is going to choose is taken in anticipation of this payoff from rebellion. Okay, so the incentive to rebel depends on how cheap it is, and the cheaper how small the punishment is. Okay, so the smaller the punishment, the more attractive it is to rebel, but the smaller the punishment, the more likely it is that the incumbent government are actually going to set a policy which is more favorable. So in some sense here, if I was going to say I'm not going to go through all the mathematical analysis, but what's the logic of the model? The logic of the model is if you make rebellion cheap, it's a way of forcing the incumbent political party to choose a policy which is as favorable as possible to the opponents. Okay. Now, why can't you just do that to start with? Why can't you let the opposition choose the policy? Well, if P is very large, so meaning if it's very likely that, think about the liberals. The liberals wrote the Constitution in Rio Negro. Then there was an election. If it's very likely that the liberals are going to win that election, then it's very hard to for the conservatives to believe that they're actually going to get to choose the policy. Okay, so that's not a solution to this problem. Okay, and writing the Constitution, you anticipate. So this is game theory. You anticipate that that's a problem. Okay, it's a problem that the liberals are bound to win, as indeed they did win. Okay, so you can't solve this problem. You can't solve the problem of keeping the conservatives happy by saying, well, you could win the election and you get to choose the policy you like, because it's very unlikely they'll win the election. So that's one problem. And the second problem is, when you're writing the Constitution, you can't commit to a favorable policy to the conservatives. So how do you in practice, in a kind of de facto way, commit to a policy which is favorable to the conservatives when the liberals are bound to win, and then when they're in power they can choose whatever policy they like? You make rebellion cheap, which kind of forces the liberals to be relatively nice to the conservatives. Okay, so that's in some sense the key thing here. This is just like writing that out in words, is that what we're calling almost legal rebellion. The 1936 Penal Code is 6 months. The rebellion was punished by 6 months to 3 years, which was written by Gaitan, by the way. I think mostly written by Gaitan. So it's a way. So in some sense, legal rebellion here is a kind of way of forcing. It's a way of forcing the incumbent government to sort of do something relatively favorable to the opposition, which otherwise you couldn't commit to, and you couldn't commit to because elections are very biased and because there's so much uncertainty about the implementation of policy. Okay, so let me. I don't want to talk too long. I think I got the idea across, but let me just say a little bit, trying to kind of say, okay, so what's the difference between the US and Colombia? So I think the model is useful because it helps you sort of discipline thinking about the difference between Colombia and the United States. As I said, if you read the debate, they understood many of the same issues. So for example, one of the things in Rio Negro, and afterwards when Mosquera was president, and was this issue of, could the federal government, the national government, intervene in the states? Okay, so they passed this famous law which basically said the federal government can't intervene. You know, if some rebels overthrow the government in Panama, then the federal government just has to recognize whoever won the rebellion as the new government in Panama. Exactly the same debate went on in Philadelphia. They debated exactly the same issue because they were worried about exactly the same thing, which is, if we create a big, powerful federal state, how do we know it's not going to destroy the autonomy of the states? And, you know, that's where all these regulations about militia, you know, who's in the militia, where did the officer corps come, or officer corps today, you know, and we were worried about, you know, we've just worried about this last year with Donald Trump. Okay, people were reading the Constitution about the militia and what could the federal government do. You know, really, it's you know, it's I'm serious. Yeah. So okay, so at least you don't have that problem anymore in Colombia. Okay, so let me just think about this. What I emphasized is, you know, this a low penalty for rebellion comes about when elections are very skewed. You know, in some sense, the liberals were bound to win in Rio Negro after 1885. The conservatives were bound to win, you know, so the boot is on the other foot, but much of the logic is similar. You know, if you go to the 1890s, I think after the 1885 constitution, between there and the War of 1,000 Days, only two liberals, Rafael Uribe and someone else whose name I can't remember, were elected to the legislature, you know. So then elections were massively skewed towards the conservatives. So there was a reversal, but the same thing persisted. And of course, this derecho de gentes clause was retained in the Colombian constitution right the way until 1991. So it was in Miguel Antonio Caro's constitution too. So why would P be so skewed, you know, very high or, you know, or very low in Colombia compared to the US? Well, I think if you look at when the US Constitution was written, political competition was much more fluid. You know, there were no political parties at the time the US Constitution was written. You know, there were these Federalists and anti-Federalists, but they weren't really a political party. So the political situation was much more competitive, and there was far less electoral corruption and fraud in the US. Okay, so, you know, here's a quote from the Diario de Cundinamarca. Elections in Colombia, I should have put the Spanish here, are terrible confrontations of press, agitation, intrigue, letters, bribes, weapons, menace. So you know, here's the, you know, el que escruta elige, you know, so I think elections were much more biased. It was very difficult to solve this problem by having a kind of level playing field with respect to elections in Colombia compared to the US. And I think, you know, there's much more evidence that, you know, this comes up a lot in the debate in Philadelphia, and also discussed in the Federalist Papers, you know. So meaning, you know, we're going to write this constitution, and you know, and it's going to work, you know. So here's Hamilton: the utility of the union as a safeguard against domestic faction and insurrection. Okay. So he's saying, he's sort of, okay, so, but is this going to work? Is this institutional architecture actually going to stop insurrection? And what's his answer? He points continually, him and Madison, to the fact that the institutions will work and people will obey the institutions. Okay, the regular distribution of power into distinct departments, the introduction of balances and checks, the institution of courts, you know, the institutions will work. People will obey the institutions. And if people obey the institutions, it distributes power, it distributes resources, and that will undermine the incentive for domestic faction insurrection. Okay. There's no such belief in the Colombian discussion, you know, and I think there's three reasons for that. At least there's three reasons we can identify. One is, you know, the legitimacy of the process. So you know, we haven't found a kind of discussion of this, you know, the trade-offs here. But of course, what's dramatic about the US Constitution is that every state had to ratify it. So then there was this kind of prolonged process of ratification. That didn't happen in Colombia. And in fact, the conservatives immediately started talking about the Rio Negro Constitution as, you know, El Cuaderno de Rio Negro. Oops, sorry, I got it as a typo there. Rio Negro, like a sort of a little pocketbook. Like this is the liberals' little pocketbook. You know, it's not a. So there's a problem of legitimacy. You know, that's obviously, that's the first issue. I think, the second issue, is this issue of state capacity that I talked about before when I was talking about the road to la Macarena, which is US states had far more capacity. Even under the Articles of Confederation, what happens is the states themselves start organizing, mechanisms for raising taxes and providing public goods and administration. And, whereas the state in 1863, Colombia, had very, very little capacity. You could say the liberals in the 1850s had sort of decapacitated the state. They undermined, the fiscal basis of the state in the 1850s. So I think the state had much less capacity. So it's very difficult to kind of use institutions in the way that Hamilton and Madison anticipated in Colombia. And also, there's just this general kind of culture in Colombia, or Latin America more broadly, of sort of not obeying the rules, like I have here, no se sapo, but you could say the more general Latin American principle would be obedezco pero no cumplo. I obey, but I don't comply. So there's a sort of culture of ignoring the rules. Okay, so let me, Locke, of course, talked about the right to rebel, but I don't think this is the same thing as that. So let me just conclude now and just say, I think what we're trying to do here is if you've got the logic a little bit, is to say, what's striking is how they were worried about these things. Mosquera, Camacho Roldan, these other people, other liberal intellectuals, Murillo Toro, they were very clever people in Rio Negro, and they were thinking about the same things. They were very well informed about the type of solutions that had worked in US, but they didn't think, maybe they didn't want to do it. We haven't, as I said, we had this question of legitimacy, and the sort of process of ratification is kind of interesting because, yes, there were delegates from all the different states at Rio Negro, but, the way they were elected was not so, unbiased. So we haven't found, I don't know, counterfactually, did they sort of think that they could, did they discuss whether or not it would have been a good idea to kind of do some ratification process? I don't know, but leaving that issue aside, so you could say some of the problems were kind of self-created. I think what's more interesting to us is that is to try to characterize the context and a kind of logic that might have led to this very low penalties for rebellion. And I think to go back to what I said right at the start is that, why is it that, Colombia looks so similar in the 19th century, but then it carries on looking like that in the 20th century, whereas other places like Venezuela become much more stable? Think of that discussion in the 1970s that I showed you at the start. This just became the logic, the Colombians internalized this way of dealing with the problem, and so disorder and sedition became a normal activity. Like Antonio Navarro said, it's every Colombian's right to try to overthrow the government with arms. It became socialized into Colombians, and I don't think that's true anymore. But it took a lot to disentangle that view from society. I think that's what's so striking about this discussion so our argument here is that, it's this particular solution to this problem. Now, Colombia is not the only country, it turns out, that chose this. That both Venezuela and the República Dominicana adopted almost the same clause, the derecho de gentes, in their constitution in the 1860s. But what's interesting is that they got rid of it very fast. Colombians kept this in the constitution till 1991. In Venezuela and República Dominicana, they got rid of it very early in the 20th century. So it never became kind of embedded in the sort of logic of the situation. Just one more theoretical issue, and then I'll be quiet, is, in some sense, the model is assuming that it's very hard to commit to, being favorable to the conservatives. Why? Because you're going to be choosing the policy yourself when in power. And also there's all this uncertainty about what the consequences of an institutional design are. Okay. So you can't commit so the legal rebellion is a way of kind of forcing the incumbent to do something relatively favorable to the opposition, to the conservatives. So how is it you can, so there's a very interesting theoretical question here, which is, how is it possible, why are you able to commit to this low penalty? Why is it that when a civil war breaks out, as it did almost immediately after Rio Negro, for example, the conservatives overthrew the liberal government in Antioquia when Murillo Toro was president. Why didn't, and Murillo Toro said, okay, fine, the conservatives are in charge of Antioquia now. Why didn't Murillo Toro say, no, forget that, we're going to throw these people in prison for 50 years or something, or we're going to hang them, and which happened previously in Colombia, and which I don't have time to talk about that, but there was also a perception here that there had been strong penalties before in the 1830s, but it hadn't worked very well. So it was sort of, we'll try something different. So there's some learning going on here also. But how could you commit to this? Because it's not really about institutional design. It's a kind of norm or a principle. So I think like the way we're sort of thinking about this is that somehow this is easier to implement or establish. It's a kind of specific thing, and they managed to establish a sort of norm or a principle that this is not what we do in Colombia. We don't punish people for rebellion. You see that in this debate in the 1970s, and somehow they sort of, in a context where it's very difficult to structure society using these formal institutions like the Constitution, somehow it was easier to do it by establishing a norm, which is exactly what they talk about in the 70s, establishing this norm. So that's a theoretical issue that needs some discussion, but just to give you a sense of how we're thinking about it. Okay, so let me shut up now. I think you got the idea.
Thank you very much, Jim, for this very thought-provoking presentation. I have 3 minor points that I want to make, and then we'll open up to questions by students and some of our professors. But before that, let me say that right now we are being followed by 133 persons, which is a good following at this hour, because this is an hour of heavy traffic in classes. So many of students are in class. Not mine, because mine are from the economic history of Colombia, should be here, but there are not so many, 21 students. The first point I want to make is the following. A big contrast is Colombia before and after independence. Before independence, the Spaniards maintained a tremendous level of order with very little challenge and very little investment in resources. As you remember, when the rebellion of the Comuneros, the only rebellion, they almost took Bogota because there were no troops in Bogota. Only after the Comuneros did they have troops in Bogota, but not so many. And the reply for the Comuneros was that the main leaders lost their head. Galan's head was taken off, so very strongly. But it's very interesting that with very little resources, and that leads me to my second point, there was a tremendous level of legitimacy of the colonial state, which is somewhat surprising, being that it was a state that was extractive. It didn't benefit the people in many senses, but it because it didn't provide many services, because they sent the money that was to Spain, not to benefit to invest locally. So I find this a little bit surprising. So, well, I think, and this leads me, and I want to be a little bit of a devil's advocate. Maybe one of the strengths of Colombia has been, and I've heard people like Fernando Cepeda Ulloa, the politologist, say that maybe one of the strengths of Colombia, given that it has never had too much legitimacy, the state has never had too much legitimacy, that it has captured the rebels generations after generations. So if you take the sort of the collective biography of the Colombian elites, you would find that many were rebels in their early in their youth. For example, well, I can give credit for I know from observation from the time I studied in Bogota and the university in the 1970s, some of the most radical, vociferous student rebel media leaders have all now been ministers. Some are well-known economists. Many are very orthodox economists, and so many have been ministers of finance. So Fernando Cepeda, one time he wrote a book on the strengths of Colombia. I don't know, you probably have seen that book. It's a nice book. It's called Strength of Colombia, Fortalezas de Colombia. And there's two volumes. And it's interesting because, Fernando is sort of like Miguel Urrutia, that sometimes they're counterintuitive in the things they say, but they're interesting things. So he wanted somebody to write a paper. Nobody wanted to write it, and I'll tell you why. That the strength of Colombia was that the rebels were accepted very nicely into the establishment with no cost, and he really wanted that. Nobody wanted to write it, and he offered it to many of the people who were in that meeting. If I remember, but I don't remember incorrectly, it was in a Liberty Fund meeting. And he offered, in front of me to 3 or 4 persons, and all of them said no. And he told me, even if I want to try, I said no, because this would be to speak about people who in the youth had been very leftist, very radical, and then they were accepted later in the establishment, which is sort of so this is, just, sort of some. So in that sense, the small penalty is sort of
not stigmatized. Yeah.
And the third thing that I want to mention is with the levels of violence that we had in the War of 1,000 Days and La Violencia. This has been numbers thrown from nowhere. The 300,000 from La Violencia, the 100,000 from the War of 1,000 Days.
Yeah.
And with the demography, well, a good demographer who got a few years ago his PhD in demographic economics from Pennsylvania University, Julio Romero. I wrote 2 papers. One is using stable population models. This is something that's done by demographers to estimate the cause of war. And if you see, for example, if we estimated that the maximum level of death for La Violencia of the 1948-58 was 39,000 and 35,000 for the War of the 1,000 Days. So the War of 1,000 Days was stronger because population was but if you look at the pyramid of population of Colombia in 1964, you don't see what you see in the European countries that went through the war. That you have, missing population because of the war deaths. France or Germany or Russia or any of these countries. That doesn't happen. It's very smooth. And the reason it's smooth is that the numbers that have been said are not are politically manipulated. So those 2 papers have not been published in journals. They have been published in the working series and the working papers of the Banco de la República in Cartagena. So if I could send it to you if you eventually are interested in those two papers. And that's what I wanted to mention. But so we can open to questions now, or I don't know if you want to react to those ones.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I can react. I mean, I think that's, you know, this. I don't know this book by Fernando Cepeda. I know him a little bit, but that sounds super relevant actually to the kind of, you know, and of course Antonio Navarro himself, you know, was in the M19 and
guerrilla.
And there's no sort of stigma attached to this. You know, I think that was part of what he was telling us. You know, and there's no. But I think, you know, so I guess my reaction is I need to read Cepeda's book, and you know, that sounds to me, my reaction is that's kind of part of this equilibrium. You know, it's all part of, you can be incorporated back into society and you don't hold grudges and yeah, so that's a very interesting observation. I think, you know, this again, I don't know very much, you know, at all about the colonial state, but perhaps I should. I mean, it's interesting, this, you know, there is this amazing data that I've actually used in several papers from the 1790s of this survey of all the sort of colonial officials, you know, military in the whole of Colombia. And, you know, what's amazing about that is exactly as you say, is how the country was governed, you know, by in such a, there were far more priests than there were soldiers.
Yes.
You know,
they were part of the order.
Yeah, maybe. That was true in the 19th century as well. You know, like that was true. I think that was true later on. You know, also. So, and you know, liberalism was a sin. So I, you know, but I don't know why. That's interesting. Why I don't really understand this. You know, to what extent the colonial state was legitimate, or why that legitimacy couldn't be transferred to the sort of Republican government, or couldn't be established, you know, in the 1820s. You know, it's kind of not obvious why the Republican government wouldn't be more legitimate in some sense in colonial government. Or, you know, so I think those are great questions. I don't know the answer to that. But it's a really interesting point also that, you know, when the Comunero Rebellion happened, yeah, they were hung, you know, or hung. I don't remember how they were killed, but so they were heavily punished. And as I said, that went on, you know, it went on to this Guerra de los Suprimos also, that people were shot, you know, for rebellion. And I think that was part of the discussion at Rio Negro. There was a sense that this somehow punishing people for, you know, hadn't worked, you know, so they were going to try something different. But we, you know, we have to write up the whole history of this. It's sort of complicated after, you know, it gets, you know, so maybe that's more like they carried on with the colonial way of doing things, but that didn't work in this new environment. But you're making me think about, we should look at that. I think that's, and, you know, I think, yeah, the some sort of rebellion is a sort of like, it's a channel of social mobility or something also, you know. I mean, I think like what's fascinating about Colombia is somehow there is a lot of social mobility. You know, there's a lot of chance for people with talent or whatever to kind of become powerful, to sort of emerge or kind of move up in society. And perhaps, you know, conflict was a way of, you know, it was a way in which that happened. I'd have to think about that. So those are all like, you know, and I can email you about Julio Romero. Yeah, I don't know that work. It sounds interesting. I guess, you know, I still maintain that, you know, Colombia is a pretty disorderly place, you know, but I take it for granted that there's a lot of politics about the numbers. So it'd be interesting to have a sense of, you know, what a more credible number was. You know, yes, that would be interesting.
Yeah, so do
you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Maisel. It has been very interesting, your presentation and the discussion. We are here with a group of students and a professor from the Department of Economics in the Laboratorio de Economía Experimental on campus. We are using this space for the first time in a bimodal conference. So we have some questions here with the people in the lab, but also we have some questions from academic channel in YouTube. So first, we have one question here from one of our former students, Paul. You can come here, maybe.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Hi. Thank you very much for the presentation. It's always good to have a fresh insight of our own history from someone from abroad. It gives you a lot of context. So thank you for the research. And my question was, as you were quoting Hamilton's view on sedition, I could not help but think about the recent sedition attempts on the U.S. So did that event change and the following impunity, that change in any way your perspective on the comparative institutional designs between Colombia and the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think this project is sort of about there's nothing sort of, I mean, what's sort of striking to me is the extent, how similar the types of issues that, they discussed were. I mean, I gave you one, example, but there's many examples, so meaning, they were all thinking about the same kind of problems. So it's not that the United States is some sort of completely different thing from Colombia or whatever. No, actually, many of the problems were sort of similar, but there was something about the context that didn't allow the Colombians to use the same types of solutions that, John Locke had recommended, or, Montesquieu or Madison and Hamilton. And I think now the attempted sedition on January the 6th, I don't think that was very serious. Trump is too incompetent and disorganized to actually overthrow the government. It wasn't really planned properly. I think if you look at Colombia or anywhere in Latin America at a kind of proper sedition, you need the army on your side. Trump didn't seem to have any real connections to the army, and so sort of, I guess, like, big picture, it was a very amateurish attempt at sedition. If you compare to Latin American contexts, but I think the U.S. system is, it is just as Hamilton and Madison were worried about. It is prone to many of the same problems that Latin American countries have faced. I do think, the US has managed to solve those problems a little, a bit better, but I don't know what the future will I don't know what the future will bring. That we've learned a lot. We've learned a lot of things are possible in the last 4 years that if you'd asked me 5 years ago, I would have said were not possible. So what I'm worried about is that somebody who's kind of much cleverer and much more organized than Trump will come along, and exploit all of these institutional problems that we now have kind of identified. The problem, just to compare 19th century Colombia to the US, for example, is, Trump couldn't mess up with the vote counting. He couldn't mess up with the vote counting. He tried to, but he was forced to do it through the legal system. He couldn't do it directly. And that turned out to be a major disadvantage for undermining the election. So there were some institutional checks and balances built in which actually functioned, and that could all have been unwound if Trump had control of the military, but he doesn't. So I mean, it's a good question. There's a lot to talk about, but I guess my big point is, thankfully, Trump is too self-centered and disorganized to really have to do sedition efficiently.
Thank you.
But I think he should go to prison. That would be good. Let's see if it happens. Yeah.
Thank you, Paul. We have a question from Raisa Schmalbach Castillo. She said, to what degree can we surely say that not punishing rebellion a good thing, considering the possibility of future anarchy and wars starting? Professor Robinson, you can read the question also in the panel.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I guess my perspective. I mean, there's many things one could say here. Our perspective, is a sort of simple one, which is this sort of Hamiltonian perspective, which is that punishing, sedition disincentivizes it and is part of kind of creating order, and not punishing it sort of encourages it and leads to disorder. But I agree that what's difficult is what's difficult is if you're in one equilibrium, how you move to the other equilibrium. So I think that's, one could imagine a situation where trying to transition from one equilibrium to another equilibrium is very difficult. Think about the Colombian case. For years and years, these fruitless negotiations with the FARC went on, for 20 years almost, which was the sort of the Colombian way of doing things. You get them to demobilize, you have a peace treaty, and it was only in the end after El Caguán, that the Colombians realized, this really isn't going to work, So they had to try something else, with President Uribe, and that did create all sorts of negative consequences. Think of the false positives, for example. You could sort of say, well, there's a problem of making a transition from one equilibrium to another equilibrium. There's a lot of chaos and what they would call collateral damage. So I think if the question is about how to make a transition from one equilibrium to another, I think the Colombian experience shows that's a costly thing to do. It's not easy for society to take that decision once you're in one equilibrium.
Thank you. A question from Jorge Andres. He says, Professor, in this electoral process, was there not at a time some kind of international organizations that could support more transparent elections? And this could have helped to solve some problems?
But you mean which electoral processes? You mean 19th century Colombian electoral processes, or?
I'm not sure. It looks like, it seems like that it refers to that time, but I think the answer.
I don't know. I think it's very hard for outsiders to kind of influence legitimacy of election. I don't think, now there's all of these different sorts of election monitors and, attempts, the Carter Foundation, people monitoring the fairness of elections. And I don't know whether there's much evidence about, social science evidence about the consequences of those interventions, sort of to improve the way things work. I think the Colombians, the Colombians sort of came up with all sorts of interesting solutions to this. So one thing that actually I studied I studied many years ago was this voto incompleto, that after the War of 1,000 Days, during the Reyes presidency, it was obvious to the conservatives that this system where the liberals had been just completely kind of crowded out of the legislature was very unhealthy. It was very unhealthy. It was like destabilizing for the liberals to be so underrepresented. But here was the problem. The problem was the conservative elites in Bogota, they couldn't stop, the conservative cacique in Monguí, stuffing the ballot box and giving 100% of the votes to the conservatives. So they didn't have enough control over the local members of the party. So what did they do? They introduced this system of this voto incompleto, which basically said, whatever the election results, the liberals get 1/3 of the seats. They just get 1/3 of the seats. End of story. And in fact, it's only in 1930 they moved to a kind of proportional representation system. And the reason they did that was that they kind of adopted a bunch of innovations in the 1920s, which made it easier to eliminate the most egregious kind of electoral malpractices. There was this famous faked election in 1922 when Benjamin Herrera, lost for the Liberals, where there was this huge amount of ballot stuffing. I did some research on that too with Leopoldo Ferguson. But so there, that's the Colombians in some sense. The Colombians kind of figuring out, okay, here's the problem. Here's a solution to the problem. It's a very it's a very heterodox solution. but it was a solution that the Colombians came up with to their problem. But I doubt outsiders can really understand the problem the way Colombians can and see what a solution is. So I think the obviously progress is much slower than you'd like. But my feeling is, the only legitimate thing that really is going to work is the Colombians themselves solving the problems, which they have done. There are examples of that. And I think this voto incompleto is very interesting as a way of, okay, here we have this problem. The state is weak. We can't really enforce these rules, but this is going to work. So. Okay.
I think we have time for one last question. Professor Jairo Parada from Department of Economics. He has one question.
Thank you, Professor Robinson, for your lecture. One problem I see in your approach is that you pay too much attention to legal rules and you leave aside traditions, political ideas, and mores, because institutions are not just legal rules. And you get the impression when I listen to your presentation that if we in Colombia have imposed the death penalty for any kind of rebellion, we would be in a better shape today. And I don't think this criteria of the US would apply here, because in Colombia you have an entrenched oligarchy through centuries that they are not willing to give up power. I don't believe in this nice story that Professor Mason showed, that all the former elected leaders were absorbed by the elites. In Colombia, if you disagree deeply with the regime, you are just killed. Even though we don't have a death penalty in practice in all the civil wars conflicts. And we have seen that in the last 30 years, the use of paramilitaries to punish the opposition, to kill the social leaders, shows that it's not just a problem of a legal article in the Constitution, but it's a behavior of the elite to use whatever means you need to stay in power. So that's my concern.
Yeah.
But, if we don't address that, you get this impression that, okay, change the code penalty, impose 30 years of jail for rebellion, and that's it. And I don't think this is going to work. That's my idea. I would like to see your comments.
Yeah. So I don't disagree with that. You should read my paper La Miseria in Colombia about that. I mean, I think what you're talking about is kind of beyond the scope of this analysis. So we're trying to focus on relatively narrow set of questions and sort of try to make this comparison between this constitutional process in the US and Colombia. But like bigger picture, I don't disagree with that. Like, one thing I point out in that paper is, if you look at like social policy innovations in Colombia, they're often the consequence of, conflict. Like after the violencia, there's an enormous expansion of, education, for example. And, there's after the Constitution of 1991, why did the Constitution of 1991 happen? Because the country was sort of ungovernable. And so then the elites had to make some sort of concessions. And again, you see a big expansion of healthcare coverage and services. And so I think that's exactly what you're talking about, in some sense, that that the elites in Colombia make concessions when the country becomes ungovernable. And on average, those concessions have been good. You know, they've made the country more inclusive. They've promoted education and public services. And, you know, what was it that fomented the election of mayors? You know, it was M19. You know, it was so I think, so I'm not disagreeing. Like you're sort of saying, what's the counterfactual? You know, so if I was going to take your comment and put it back into our model, you know, you're saying we should have the model should be kind of extended, so this sort of mechanisms you're thinking about are included. And so I'm not disagreeing with you, but I guess I'm just sort of saying, like, you know, we want to try to focus on this one set of issues. And, you know, in some sense you could say, you know, these issues were driven by a kind of elite calculation or an elite calculus, you know, about how to live together like civilized gentlemen, you know, but, you know, you're talking about bigger issues about what's the consequences of that for social transformation. So I have to think more about what you're saying, but I would say, if you read my paper, La Miseria en Colombia, which is in Desarrollo y Sociedad, I think you'll find it fairly sympathetic to your argument. Yeah.
Professor Robinson, thank you very much for participating in this first event for the celebration of the 20th anniversary of the economics program. Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Maisel, and thank you all of you. If you connected to the transmission, we are going to have another events during the year commemorating the anniversary of the economics department. Thank you, all of you, the people who come to the Laboratorio de Economía Experimental. We have students of the program, we have a professor, also the dean of de la División de Ciencias Humanas. He was with us this morning. We have also some students from the Master in Economics. Thank you, all of you. We hope to see you in our next event on March. It will be the Jornada Académica del Observatorio de Condiciones Socioeconómicas. All of you are welcome to that event. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Goodbye.
My pleasure. Yeah.
Bye.